But there was a Hasidic Rebbe who lived in Los Angeles for almost 40 years. And at one time he had a very significant following in Poland, thousands of Hasidim. And I want to end tonight by talking about the Yabloner Rebbe, who none of you have ever heard of. Rabbi Yechezkel Taub. But I want to tell you what happened to me 2 weeks ago. Because everything you're about to hear is as a result of something that happened 2 weeks ago. About 10 or 15 years ago, I bought a pamphlet. You know, I'm a collector of curiosities, Jewish books. I bought a pamphlet, Hasidim Olu El Ha'aretz. There you go. There's the Yabloner Rebbe on the left. The Yabloner Rebbe and his farming Hasidim. Any of you here heard of a place called Kfar Hasidim? Kfar Hasidim, it's in the north of Israel. Near Haifa, that's right. Rechasim and Kfar Hasidim. Near the Kishon. Are there any Hasidim there? Yes. No. I've been there. There's no Hasidim there. There's a Litvish yeshiva. There's no Hasidim there. In fact, where the Litvish yeshiva is, Rechasim, which was a refugee camp after 1948, and they attached it to Kfar Hasidim. Kfar Hasidim is Hapoel HaMizrahi, and it is mainly secular Jews living there. I always wondered about that. Look at this picture. What happened to Kfar Hasidim? Well, it was founded as an agricultural settlement in 1924 by two Rebbes, two Hasidic Rebbes, real Hasidic Rebbes from Poland, the Yabloner Rebbe and the Koznitzer Rebbe. And the Koznitzer Rebbe was convinced, they were both convinced by a man called Admor HaChalutz, the pioneer Hasidic rabbi, Rabbi Yeshaya Shapira. He was the founder of Hapoel HaMizrahi. You may or may not have heard of him. You will almost certainly have heard of his brother, Reb Klonimus Kalman Shapira, who was the Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto. These were Polish Hasidic aristocracy. And Rabbi Yeshaya Shapira, their father, died. His father died when he was very young. He was brought up by his grandfather, who was a very interesting man, because even though he had a following of many thousands, he was a big supporter of the Chovevei Tzion movement, which was before the proto-Zionist movement, before Zionism, and he encouraged Hasidim to settle in Israel. And his grandson, one of his grandchildren, became the Rabbi Piatzesner, the Rebbe, and the other grandson moved to Israel during the Ottoman Turk period and became the Rebbe Chalutz. He came back to Poland. He was a masterful speaker, and he told all the Hasidim, this is never going to work unless we move entire communities from Poland to Palestine. That means not a few Hasidim. The Rebbe has got to go with his Gabba and his Shamus and his wife and his children and his family and his Hasidim and the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. And we've got to open settlements of Hasidim in Israel. And he convinced these two Rebbes, the Yabloner Rebbe, who was the Taub family, he was descended from Rabbi Yechezkel Taub of Kuzmir. The Mojitz Hasidim are Taubs, and it was a very affluent Hasidus. And they moved. The thing is, I heard this story, and I know he moved to Israel, and I could tell that obviously the whole thing failed because there's no Hasidim there, and there's no Yabloner Rebbe there. Now, the more you look into it, the more vague the story got. And it seems that sometime in the late 1930s, the Yabloner Rebbe disappeared. Disappeared. Completely. And there was a report in 1960 in Haaretz that he had actually moved to Los Angeles, and he had an assumed name, an alias. His name was George Nickel. And I moved to Los Angeles some years later, and I looked for George Nickel. And I'm good at research. I never found a trace of him. I mentioned him here and there. Somebody said he'd worked with the Kornwasser family. Other people said he occasionally davened at Rabbi Ginsburg's shtibel. Couldn't find a trace of George Nickel. You know, he was feted in the 1920s by the Zionists for moving. This was the great white hope. He was moving to the land of Israel, and he was going to bring the ultra-Orthodox community, the Hasidim, to Israel. He was visited by Rav Kook and all the other chief rabbis. There he is, sitting in the middle. That's the Yabloner Rebbe. He was visited by Lord Balfour, by Achad Ha'am, Chaim Bialik, Lord Rothschild. Have we got that picture? There's Achad Ha'am sitting there in the middle with the Yabloner Rebbe behind him. It says on the picture, it says Yabloner Rebbe. And that man standing on the other side with a white beard, that's Lord Rothschild. And the man standing next to Lord Rothschild is Chaim Bialik. It's 1925. This was a sensation. Hasidim are moving to the land of Israel. And I've tried for years to find out more, and I couldn't find out anything. Intriguingly, he's buried in Kfar Hasidim, and we have a picture of his grave. Look what it says there. Ha'admo Yechezkel Taub Rebbe mi Yabloner. And it says somewhere there that he's the Meyased of Kfar Hasidim. Here, there. Yased נחלת Ya'kov לימים Kfar Hasidim. I want to tell you something. We have a principle in Judaism, in the Jewish custom. You never write something on a gravestone which is even slightly untrue. And I know that the man wasn't the Yabloner Rebbe, for many years. And he wasn't in Kfar Hasidim. How did he end up back in Kfar Hasidim? And he's buried there. And it's a mystery. And I decided 3 or 4 weeks ago that for this lecture, I am going to find out, whatever it takes, I'm going to find out about the Yabloner Rebbe. I need to know what happened. I'm going with Eli to Israel, and we're going to the north to Rosh Hanikran, to Akko, and I'm going to stop on the way past Haifa. I'm going to go to Kfar Hasidim, and I'm going to randomly knock on doors, and I'm going to find out about Yechezkel Taub, George Nickel, Yabloner Rebbe, whatever his name was. I want to know about him. I'm not going back to Los Angeles without this information. I'm on the plane, and you know that you have internet now on the plane. Is it a blessing or a curse? I'll leave that to you to decide. And I decided, I had this flash, that every kibbutz and moshav has one meshuggah who's the archivist. Do you know that? Oh, it's everyone who's the archivist of that kibbutz, right? I'm sure Kfar Hasidim has a meshuggah. It must be, right? So I'm researching online for an hour, 2 hours. You know, the internet's not fast on the plane. And eventually I come up, there's a man who's called Ehud Yonai. He's dead. He died in 2012. And you may or may not have heard of him. Ehud Yonai is very famous in Hollywood because he wrote Top Gun. Thank you. It's very good. He, and then later wrote the history of the Israeli Air Force. He lived in California. There was a magazine called The Californian. And he was one of their main journalists. And he wrote an article in 1983 called Top Guns about the Air Force Base in San Diego, which resulted, the Navy base in San Diego, and it resulted in the movie Top Gun, starring Tom Cruise. Anyway, he moved back to Israel. What should I do with this? And he wrote this book about the Israeli Air Force. And guess where he lives? Kfar Hasidim. And there is a little center dedicated to his memory, run by his wife, Shoshi. In Kfar Hasidim, they also opened an olive farm, and they sell olive oil. And she also does little tours of the area about the Miyastim, the founders of Kfar Hasidim. I email her from the plane, "Dear Shoshi, you're going to think I'm nuts. Have you ever heard of the Yabloner Rebbe? Yours sincerely, Pini." 5 minutes later, I get an email back. Of course I've heard of him. He was my uncle. I write an email back. "Dear Shoshi, see you on Thursday. I'll be there at 2. I was there at 1:30. Let me tell you the story of the Yabloner Rebbe. This is the story. It's a remarkable story. The Yabloner Rebbe became the Rebbe by accident. His brother-in-law was meant to be the Rebbe. But his brother-in-law died, and then his father died, and he was 24 years old, very charismatic, very charming, and highly intelligent. And he becomes the Rebbe of Yabloner, which is like a resort town not far from Warsaw. And Rabbi Shapira comes along, and Rabbi Shapira fires him up. Suddenly he has a purpose in him being a Rebbe. And he calls together all his Hasidim. He says, Moirai v'Rabosai, what are we doing here in Poland? Are we crazy? Mashiach is coming. We've got to move to Israel. We've got to move to Eretz Yisrael. They said, we can't move. Where are we going to go? He said, what are you talking about? We're a wealthy Hasidus. We've got plenty of money. I've got an idea. The wealthy ones are going to fund me to buy land in Palestine from Syrian landowners. And I'm going to go with the poorer members of this Hasidic group, and we're going to build a Kfar. We're going to build beautiful homes. We're going to build a dairy farm. And when it's all built, and we'll build your homes, and you'll have your land, and you're going to come, and you're going to join me. And he raised an enormous sum of money, and he bought 30,000 dunams of land in 1924. That's 10,000 acres. A beautiful hill, I saw it. A beautiful hill overlooking the Kishon River and a massive valley in the Jezreel Valley. And he came with hundreds of Hasidim, 200-300 Hasidim in 1924-25. They arrived. And everything that could go wrong went wrong. Malaria, Bedouins killing them, and the Zionist organizations completely lost interest. I mean, it was a lot of fun for propaganda, but they weren't particularly interested in religious Jews being farmers in the north of Israel. And then the Hasidim became angry because they heard about their family members who had malaria and were being killed by Bedouin, and they stopped giving money. And his Hasidim began to starve because there's no social services and there's no money from the government. And they said, we want to go back to Poland. He said, no, you can't go back to Poland. We're going to bring the Yabloner Hasidus, we're bringing it to the Holy Land. And he went to the Zionist authorities, to the JNF, and he went to the Jewish agency, and he said, I don't have any money. I've run out of money. I've been back to Poland. There's no money there for me anymore. But I'll tell you what I have got. I've got land. I'll swap land with you, for food and for expertise to build a farming community. And they agreed, and they bartered, and they took the land, and they sent him a kvutza, a group of Hapoel HaMizrachi, modern Orthodox, we would call it today, Jewish farmers who trained on Hachshara. They weren't peddlers and schnorrers from Yabloner in Poland. And they changed it from a dairy farm to orchards, and they moved it from the top of the mountain to the valley where it is today. And slowly things started to get better until the anti-Semitism in Europe got bad, and the Hasidim started coming from Poland. And they knock on his door, where's our land? Well, I don't have it. What do you mean you don't have it? We paid for it. Where's our land? You promised us beautiful homes in Israel. I don't have the land. I had to give it because the Hasidim were dying. Well, give us our money back. I don't have any money. You're a ganef. Suddenly the Yabloner Rebbe, the hero, visited by Rav Kook and Lord Balfour, is a ganef. And his niece, Shoshi, told me that on one occasion, the Hasidim ganged up. He was in the bathroom, and they broke open the bathroom door, and they started hitting him. He had nowhere to go. So he went to America. He had family in America, the Mesrich family in America, in New York, to raise money. He thought, maybe I can raise some money there, I can pay back the Hasidim, the debts that I owe them. His wife went back to Poland. He had no children, and the Second World War broke out. And he heard reports that his entire Chassidus had been wiped out. He can't go back to Poland. He can't go back to Kfar Hasidim. And he's working in New York, and he decides that he can't be religious anymore. And he shaved off his beard, and he cut off his payas, and he took off his yarmulke, and he stopped keeping Shabbos, and he went to open a branch of his family's business in California, and he decided he needs to change his name. And I've got his immigration papers to show you. And this is the first time he signed it with his name. Not George Nickel, my friends. Ronnie, remember I sent you an email? George Nagel. And he went into a self-imposed witness protection program. And he never spoke to anybody who knew him. There were certain individuals in the community who knew him. He had nothing to do with the Jewish community. And his family in Kfar Hasidim were aware of his existence, and they referred to him by a code name, Uncle Dod. Dod is the word for uncle in Hebrew. And they kept in touch with him. He became very wealthy. Because there's one thing he knew from Kfar Hasidim, it was construction. He started buying land in the valley and building cheap homes and selling them. And he slowly built himself up and built more and more homes and more homes and became very wealthy. In the late 1960s, he decides, I'm not building cheap homes anymore. I'm going to build an apartment complex. And he built the apartment complex, and it seems, from what I heard from his family here in California, that he was no longer at the top of his game. He was already in his 70s, and he was ripped off by all the subcontractors, and it was very shoddily put together, and he couldn't sell the apartments, and the banks took it away, and he was left with very little. And he was unbelievably upset by this, and he became sick, and he went to hospital, and he almost died. While he's in hospital, he thinks to himself, what am I doing this for? What am I making all this money for? What do I need it for? I want to learn. So he decided to enroll himself at CSUN in Northridge, and he moved into the dormitory. And George Nagel became the celebrity student at CSUN because every single student wanted to have to do with him. There were articles that were written about it. We've got the newspaper report there. This is from 1972, but it was across the United States. In many newspapers, this article about the senior, George Nagel, 77, shares the world of the young, a dorm of Cal State Northridge, now it's called CSUN. And he's a student. He studied psychology, and he graduated with a psychology degree. There's a picture of his graduation. That was his bachelor's degree. He then took a master's. We have the psychology degree certificate as well. He wrote his master's. The thesis was called Paradise Cove. It was more or less autobiographical, and it's fascinating. Ehud Yonai had moved in the 1960s or 70s and kept in touch with him. And Ehud Yonai was at his graduation, 1975, said to him, it's time for you to come home. Enough already, come home. He said, I can't come home, they hate me. He said, no, you can come home. What am I going to do if they hate me? He says, there are enough hotels in Tel Aviv. If you come there and you don't feel comfortable, you go to a hotel in Tel Aviv and you'll fly back to Los Angeles. He says, I need to pass my master's. He passed his master's, and around 1980, he came back. George Nagel, Yechezkel Taub, Yabloner Rebbe came back to Kfar Hasidim, not sure what to expect. He comes back, and they have a big party, a celebration, reception for him. And one after another, the pioneers, the original settlers of Kfar Hasidim get up, and they say, Rebbe, you saved our lives. Our families all died in the Holocaust, and you pushed us like crazy to come here, and we hated you. And we wanted to go back to Poland, but you made us stay, and we stayed. And our families all died, and there's nothing left of them. And look at our children, and our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. Look what we've set up here, and it's all because of you. Please come home. And he put his yarmulke back on, and he grew back his beard, and he grew back his payas, and he became the Yabloner Rebbe. And he died in 1986 and was buried in Kfar Hasidim as one of the miyasdim of that Kfar. It's an unbelievable story. It's like a Hollywood story. In Hollywood. So when we talk about, and when we talk about Hasidic Rebbes in Hollywood, I'm not talking about the B-listers. I hate to say that. This was an A-list Hasidic Rebbe that you had here in your midst for almost 40 years. And he came back, and there is salvation, there is hope. And nobody's ever seen these pictures before. And nobody knows this story. It's the first time it's being told. And I will leave it here.